Welcome to the start of chapter 43, where we're going to talk about the immune system. Uh, it's kind of fitting that I'm doing this while still at the tail end of being sick, because my immune system is currently at least supposed to be working. We'll see if it's doing so properly. These are going to be some of the cells that we have within our normal blood. This is our red blood cell, which looks oftentimes kind of like a donut that didn't quite get the hole completely removed, so it just got kind of a divot. And then you've got the white blood cells, where a lot of these are phagocytic, so they tend to, oftentimes, their shape can be a little indeterminate because they can wiggle around, so they can go around stuff. But they do actually tend to look whitish. So it is actually a reason that there are white blood cells and red blood cells. It's not one of those tricky things. Now, for our immune system, we do have different lines of defense, and it starts off with things that just try to protect us in general, and then you get things that are a little bit more specific, and then you eventually get to things that are very, very specific. So as we start off, the most non-specific method we have, our first line, is just a barrier. We have our skin, hopefully. You don't have problems with that. That'd be a big deal. And so our skin prevents things from getting into our interstitial fluid, into our blood, into any of the fluids that's in our body, so it can't do much damage. We also have secretions, some proteins and such that are antimicrobial that are part of our skin. You have mucus, there's other stuff that you can secrete that capture things and really prevent things from getting where they're not supposed to be. So our first line is just, all right, let's put up essentially a fence. And this fence happens to also have some secretions on it that are like glue that either make you stick to it or that are like poison that would just kind of kill you anyway. So that's the first line. Now, if you get past the fence, though, we do have another line of fairly non-specific defenses. So once again, it's not going after a specific bad guy. These are normally just going to go after things in general that are just not us. And so we'll also have a host of other proteins that are antimicrobial. So they'll go after, it could be like, bacteria in general, or they could go after or specific chemicals in general. You have white blood cells. We have quite a few of these guys that are not really going to go after specific pathogens. Like, they're not going to say, I'm the guy that goes after polio. They're going to say, I'm the guy that says, you don't look like my cells, so I'm going to kill you. And so they're more of a bouncer than a bounty hunter. The specific guys are much more of like the bounty hunter type. They're going to go after their specific guy. I'm the guy for trying to think of diseases that I can use that I don't want to pretend I have. But hopefully, it's chicken pox or something like that. I'm trying to avoid herpes. So you're going to go after somebody specific, and you're going to try to destroy those. And the guys that do that, we tend to call lymphocytes. And those lymphocytes, at least some of them, will produce antibodies. So when you see people talk about things like antibodies, they're talking about a very specific aspect of our immune system. When we talk about normal white blood cells, when we talk about inflammation, like generally where you just swell up and the area just gets hot and it might hurt, that's going to be more of a non-specific thing. That's where you're just kind of going after anybody in a particular group. Now, phagocytes and natural killer cells. So these are guys that'll go around and they will try to do damage to cells and organisms that might get into our body. So these are going to be some of our general immune system cells that kind of do cleanup. These guys will also be more non-specific than the guys we're going to cover next, because there will be these T cells and these B cells, we'll call them lymphocytes, that are going to be a bit more particular than these guys. So neutrophils, this is like 70% of your white blood cells. These are like your average grunt that goes around munching on stuff. When there's an infection, you send a whole bunch of these guys in. They're like the infantry. If you have pus, it's a whole bunch of neutrophils largely fighting it out with whatever bacteria or anybody else trying to get in that particular area. So that's neutrophils. Macrophages, which are just a matured version of a monocyte. If you see that term, don't freak out. I'm just kind of ignoring it because they tend to become macrophages. These guys are these big cells that can go around either engulfing stuff, or they can use enzymes to ultimately destroy cells. And so they tend to either patrol, or in some cases we can kind of like lay down a macrophage like amongst connective tissue and just be like, none shall pass. And so they can just guard an area. So these guys are going to be one that we'll use frequently because they tend to stick around. They're not, as needed. These guys are more like the posted guards rather than the, hey, look, something terrible happened, now send in the troops. That's more the neutrophil idea of like the troops. Eosinophils, these guys go after stuff that's bigger, so like parasitic worms, flukes, some protists. These guys aren't going after things like bacteria. they're going to go after larger structures and try to destroy them. So you can expect that some of these guys would be perhaps a bit more enzymatic in their function of killing rather than trying to engulf something too huge. But they're still going to go after and try to kill anything that's foreign that's just too large for a lot of these other guys that rely a little bit more on phagocytosis. You know, their solution to stuff is let's eat it. But they're going to have to deal with stuff that's just too big for most of those solutions to work. And then lastly, natural killer cells are actually a type of lymphocyte, like those more specific guys we talked about. But their basic job, and the reason they're different from these ones, is these ones tend to look after our own cells. So these are the cells that go after cancerous cells, they might go after virus-infected cells, so they're looking for something amiss with our own cells, versus going after bacteria and somebody that's they can see obviously is just not us. Now, the inflammatory response, before we kind of get into specific community more, this is going to be one of the common ways of responding in a non-specific way to any type of injury or issue that's going on in the body to try to prevent it from becoming a bigger issue. You know, if something happens where you get cut, so we've got, you know, hey, this needle, it's got green stuff in it, doesn't look good. If I stab you in the finger with it, we can assume here that that needle probably wasn't the cleanest, but even if it was, you still have an opening now in this barrier that is our skin. So there's now this wonderful opening for anybody who wants to mess with you or use you as its new home to get in. So the inflammatory response tries to preempt anybody from getting a foothold, even if the gate is down to the castle, if you will. And so the response here is you have specific cells, they're called mast cells actually, will release histamine, whatever you want to call it. So the mast cells release this. Histamine then, which also is part of the allergic reaction, which is why you get an inflammatory response when you have allergies. You know, my eyes are running, I'm all swelled up and puffy. This is going to make it where you tend to get where more blood flows to the area, and that blood goes through the capillaries, that's essentially your blood vessels, and it leaks into this area so you get swelling. And you get the redness, obviously, because you have a bunch of red blood cells and such that are coming there, and it also heats it up. So there's kind of this cascade that goes on, where you say, all right, I'm going to send a whole bunch of white blood cells, because that's part of this process, and fluid, and I want that white blood cells and that fluid to get into the tissues. So I'm going to send this stuff out into the tissues, which is going to lead to the swelling of the tissues, and then to help kind of prevent any bacteria from living too well, we're also going to crank up the heat, and so you tend to get this heat and this redness that you characterize a lot of wounds as, because by raising the temperature, you can actually kill many bacteria that can't survive that. So now at this point of entry where all this stuff can come, we now have a bunch of fluid that's been heated up, so it should be more inhospitable, plus we have a whole army of white blood cells that are there to try to fight anybody off that made it in. And so you just notice where you look down and you're like, it's red, it's hot, it's puffy. But that's what the inflammatory response is supposed to do. It's got all the troops there, it's got all the resources there, it's got everything prepared to make it as difficult for something to get in and survive as possible. So this is kind of our last ditch attempt before we have to go, crap, somebody slipped by us. Now if somebody does slip by, now we have to worry about specific immunity. So specific immunity is we're trying to deal with an infection that we do have, and we need to figure out a way ideally to go after this one specific guy because he's gotten past the outer ramparts. And so we have two types of lymphocytes. Natural killer cells are one of them, we said, but they're not part of this. And those will be B cells and T cells. And they're named after which part they mature in. So B cells mature in the bone marrow. That's kind of the insides of some of your larger bones. And then you're going to have where the T cells mature in your thymus, which is going to be this kind of funky region that's located right above your heart. So you can think of it as like upper chest or lower neck. And so that's where those guys are going to be at. And so these guys, once they're produced by these pluripotent stem cells, and you'll notice this is important because these B cells and T cells are going to be different, slightly different for each particular pathogen. That's why they're specific. This is also why it takes time for us to produce them, because you have to make them to match this new pathogen that you're exposed to, this new bacteria, virus, whatever. And so these pluripotent stem cells that are located in your bone marrow and your thymus, etc., they can produce a variety of different B and T cells, so they can make the one that's needed. And they can even differentiate new ones as we're exposed to more and more diseases and pathogens throughout our life. Now, what triggers these guys is something called an antigen. So this is typically a protein that's on a cell or a structure, could be chemical too, that triggers our immune system. That's pretty much what it is. So most antigens, or at least a lot of them we'll talk about, they're meant to say this guy's bad. But there are some cases where you can have antigens that are located on stuff like pollen where they're not meant to say it's bad, but our body can still mount an immune response. So it's pretty much any molecule that our immune system can see and say, no, you're not supposed to be here. Antibodies will be structures produced by B cells, and these guys will attach to antigens, and their basic job is to go after and destroy or neutralize that particular antigen. And so by them going after that antigen, they can then destroy the pathogen that's attached to that antigen. Because the antigen's like one part of it, it's one piece sticking off the edge of a bacteria. And so this is one way that we can release these antibodies and then destroy the pathogen in question. But once again, antibodies will be very specific. There's an antibody for pretty much each virus, each bacteria, but you can't just give somebody antibodies for rabies and be like, that'll cure your flu. No, it's not going to affect the flu. It only goes after rabies. There's a separate antibody for each strain of flu that you get. That's what you get with a lot of, that's what you're trying to make at least with a lot of vaccines. They're giving you different types of flus and such to make you produce antibodies for them. Because once you have the antibody, you can attack it. And then antigen receptors, these are going to be on some of our cells where they have the ability to kind of read these antigens so they can figure out who's around. This is critical because they have to know who's there. They have to know what antigens are kind of messing around so they can then respond to it by making or cloning the appropriate B and T cells to go attack it. So this is going to be a lot of stuff we're going to discuss in more detail coming up, is just how this process works. So starting off, clonal selection, if we know that there's one specific guy that's around, and so we need to go after him, what'll happen is we will clone the particular B and or T cells, usually we talk more about this with B cells, but either or, that ultimately can go after that particular guy. And so we'll call these guys effector cells, the ones that actually go and attack it. So those are our soldiers, our lymphocytes that are able to go after that specific guy we're trying to get. And then after we've made these effector cells, we're going to keep some of them as memory cells that last a long time. So in the future, if something comes back to us, we can use these memory cells to quickly do clonal selection and make a whole bunch of copies. And so that way this whole process occurs much faster. And so the second time around, you shouldn't get sick. The second time around, we don't have to get a feel for how to fight this guy. We just go up and just beat him down, and then we're good. So that's why you typically don't get an infection a second time. So using the terminology, the primary immune response is going to take a while from the initial infection. So this will be time on the bottom, and this will be essentially our reaction. So this is, if I can write really small. So this would be like the number of antibodies, you could say, that are in the blood. And so you'll see that it starts off where after the initial exposure, where you first do it, it's going to take a while, several days, up to a week, before it kind of starts going, and then you have a response. And then after that, it'll kind of come down. But if you expose something to it for the second time, and you'll see it stays a bit higher because we have stuff that's already hanging around, these memory ones. If you expose it a second time, it will very, 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 very rapidly shoot up higher than it was before. You get a much more marked reaction, because it's already got the stuff waiting. So instead of being like, all right, let me figure this out, it's just like, boom. As soon as I expose it, you've got within, maybe a day, it's suddenly got this huge immune response to it. And so that's why you don't tend to get sick the second time, assuming that you had a good enough immune response the first time, assuming you've got these memory cells hanging around. Because when we produce these, you'll see B cells are called plasma cells when they're working. That's a type of effector cell. So when you've got these effector cells or plasma cells, and the idea here is they create and leave those memory cells, and the memory cells are the reason that our secondary immune response is actually going to be better than the first, the primary. That's why for many people they talk about if you can survive it, it makes you stronger. And there's actually truth to that with your immune system, because if you can survive it, you are actually more prepared for it the next time. And so that disease should not lay you low again, so long as you make it through the first time. Now the danger is, of course, that many diseases can be so harsh the first time that they could kill you. And so at that point, you're not really stronger. You're dead. I'll do one last slide here. So self-non-self recognition. Within our body, one of the key things about our particular immune system is trying to figure out which cells are our cells and which cells are not our cells. This is one of the most critical things. This is why evolutionarily your immune system is one of the most selected for things, because we're constantly battling parasites, pathogens, all kinds of stuff that are small but are constantly kind of at war to use our resources and that can kill us. And so when we're doing this, our body has to be very good at distinguishing how to go after those things and leave our cells alone. Now, some people screw this up, and that's how you get autoimmune diseases. So there are some like multiple sclerosis, lupus, Crohn's, colitis, type 1 diabetes, or insulin dependent as they call it. There's lots of different diseases where our body screws this up and decides to go attack parts of our own body. And so we call those autoimmune diseases, where it's a screw up, where it just doesn't seem to recognize some of our cells as being our cells. But it's still critical that we can do this process. You know, that happens, but overall that's because there's so much pressure on the immune system to not miss anybody, because if it misses a pathogen, it can mean death. But at the same time, sometimes it gets a bit overeager, and so it can cause mischief then. And to do this, some of the things it uses are things called these MHC, or major histocompatibility complexes. And so these are just going to be antigens, so these molecules and proteins that are on our membrane. And so it can read those and try to figure out if they match what our cells have, what they should have. And so all cells will have these class 1 types, and then there are a separate type that's used just for our immune cells. So it's kind of like if you've got the normal phone lines that everybody uses, and then you've got the secure, like governmental ones for our protection, like our immune system is trying to protect us. They've got their own type that's located just on immune cells. So class 1's the normal. And so when we talk about like blood transfusions, when we talk about organ transplants, they're looking at these surface molecules, these surface antigens that can trigger immune responses, and trying to make sure they match between donors. Because if I give you something and it's got an antigen that you recognize is not you, you're going to try to kill it, whether it's a kidney, whether it's blood. And so especially if you're sick, this can be even more lethal for you now than you were before. And so they've got to be very careful about making sure all these things align, and that's why, because it's genetically linked, your relatives are more likely to be a match for you than other people. So it's useful to be nice to your relatives just in case you need to ask for some spare parts.